Okay, welcome to episode 10 of the Learning React in 2021 series. In this one, we're going to be talking about a bunch more things related to routing. So last episode, episode 9, we were talking about the basics of routing, and the link to the GitHub repo with everything is down in the description. You'll see that there is a episode for each one of the videos. So episode 10, this is the one that we're looking at this time. We're building this. Now, last time and the previous videos, if you go to the branch before it, that was the starting code. In this one, I've made a bunch of changes because we're going to be talking about a lot of things with this one. We're going to be talking about dynamic routing. We're going to be talking about using the React Router DOM hooks. We're going to be talking about redirects. We're going to talk about where you store state to be most efficient. We're going to talk about dealing with empty results and nav links versus links. So a whole bunch of different things to talk about in this episode. So to speed us along the way, I've made a bunch of changes to the code that we were using last time. We've removed what was here a component called search history, which is over on the side, and we had search results last time that we replaced with our main element. The main element now takes up this entire space in the middle, and then we're going to be loading either home or films or people or planets. One of those 4 components is the way this works right now. All right, let's jump in to VS Code. Now, I've added a markdown file here just to explain 2 different approaches that we're going to be taking to organizing our components and organizing our state. So this is the basic layout for the page. We've got our app with header, and actually that's for the capital H, that's our header component from in here. Then there's a search bar component under that. Then we've got some HTML, the main element, and inside of that there's this main component. So main component, there's 2 different ways that we can organize it. The first one is inside of here we're going to have this div and then people and person. We're going to look at those as if there's 2 different routes, and we'll decide if we want to display one or if we want to display both. So there's going to be some decision making that we do right in here, and we're going to be looking at dynamic routing to control that. The other approach is what I'm doing with the films and planets. So this is people and person. They're both inside of main. State for people is going to be stored inside of main. The other way we can do this is, like I've got people here, but just to make this a little bit more reflective, we're going to say planets, and then inside that is planet. So planet is inside of here. We have the first level of routing, which takes us to planet, and then inside of planets, that's where we actually get the state, and we'll say for planet, and this is planet as well, from planets to planet. So inside of planets, this top level one, that's where we're putting the state, the data for films and planets is going to be at that top level. And then inside of that is the other component, nested inside. So what's the difference between these 2? The primary difference is where we're storing that data. If we store the data inside of planets, films, people, if the data gets stored there and then there's a child component where we're displaying the details, it means every time we unmount planets, people, or films, when we unmount that component, we're losing that state data. Our main component never gets unmounted because it's the container for all these other things. So we've got the base layout here, and there's our main component. You can see there's no routing taking place up at the top level at app.js. Inside of main, if we go there, inside of here, what we're doing is our basic routing. Now, I've removed the switch statement here, and I've removed it because without switch, we're no longer bound to a single route. If I was to put switch back in here, and switch is wrapped around all these other elements, films, planets, people, it looks at these different paths, and it says, as soon as it finds one that matches perfectly, then it's going to go there, and it's going to ignore everything else from that point on. So if people was rendered, we wouldn't get people / and then some number. You can see here, films and planets. We've got film is inside of here. Planets has planet inside of there. And we're doing the fetch for the data inside of those components. So I'm going to go back to without the switch because we do want two routes, people and people / some number. We want both those components to be rendered. For these ones, the data is fetched at this level inside of main, and it's kept here. So main never unmounts, so we always have the people data. With planets and films, the data is stored in those components, so as soon as you go away from this, as soon as you're no longer doing this route, it means that data is gone. All right, so let's take a look at films and planets first of all. So films, this is what we're going to be looking at. We're going to create a state variable called list with useState. That's going to hold the list of films. We use useEffect. When the page initially loads, this is going to run. We fetch the data from the Star Wars API. We fetch that data. When it comes back, we get the results, and then we're going to pass those results through setList, which is our function right here, and save it. So now the data with the JSON data with the list of films is inside our films.js component. Down inside the body here, we're looping through it to write out all of our links. And then we're going to add a route that says if we've got the ID added onto the end of the films, so I've got a route inside of a component that is also inside of a route. And you can do this. You can have multiple levels of routing. This is where film gets loaded, and we're passing find film. We're passing that function right here, find film, down into the film component so that the film component can call find film. So we're extracting that from props. Normally what we have up in here is props. Props right here, and then you'd say props.findFilm. Or we can use destructuring right here and just say the only thing in props that I need right now is find film. So I'm grabbing find film and I'm going to call find film right here. So inside my useEffect, which runs after this component loads. So after the rendering has been done, and I'll come back and talk about this in a minute, but after the rendering has been done, we're going to call setFilm with the result of find film. We're taking the ID for the specific film. I'll come back and talk about this. This is one of the routing hooks. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I'm taking the ID for the current film, passing that back up to films. It's going to run through this thing and find the actual object. And then that object gets returned to us and saved here as the state. And then it will be used to render the page. Okay, in the browser. So when I click on films, there's a little bit of a delay and then the data gets loaded and written out here. When I click on one of these, I'm going to be adding the number into the URL. Right now it's just films. So there is no film component here yet. But the data is stored inside a film list. If I navigate away, let's say I go to planets. You can see there was a delay and then it loaded it. I go back to films, there's a delay and then I load it. Every time we go back to the component and it gets remounted, the fetch runs again. The fetch gets the data and puts it into films. I click on here, then film gets loaded. It finds out what the ID was from here. We pass that back up to the function in films and say, tell me, give me back the object for the one film that we're dealing with. That comes back down here and is set as state, so this can re-render. And Planets is doing the exact same thing. I click on the link, there's a delay, it loads, it displays the list. I click on one of them, that adds to the URL. This component is then rendered for the first time. The ID, 9, gets passed back up to the function. It loops through the data that's stored inside of Planets. Planets finds the one object. It's passed back in here, set in state, and then this can re-render with the actual data from the object. Okay, so planets and films. There's always a delay. If I'm away from the component and it was unmounted and I come back to it, I'll always see that no films, no planets. There's always that delay. Now people, we've done something different with people. Inside of people, we don't have the fetch here. The data is not stored inside of people. It's passed down as a prop. We're destructuring here to extract props.list. So list is inside of props. We're destructuring. We've got that. Then inside of our page, here's me looking at the prop and deciding what I want to render. So this is one way of conditional rendering. We can say, look at this property, compare it to this value. If this is true, then I'm going to render this thing. If it's not true, I don't render the second part of this. So the no people, this paragraph with no people inside of it, is not going to render if the length of the array passed in was anything other than 0. If it is, then I run this map, and I'm going to write out the NavLinks with all of them. I'll come back and I'll talk about link versus NavLink in a minute. But right now, we're just passing in a prop. You can see all that I have here is this. There's nothing else in my component other than writing out the list. I don't have person inside of here. I have no fetch inside of here. All this does is render either the message or the list. Back into the browser. When I click on here, you can see there was a bit of a delay, and then it did it. So it said no people because there was no data, but the data was coming from a prop being passed from main. So no people, and then there's the list. Now the difference here is when I leave and go to films, people was unmounted, films was rebuilt, so I saw the message about no data, and then there's the list. Planets, no planets, and then the list. I go back to people, there's not going to be a delay. It's just instantly there, and that is because the data is stored inside of main. It's at the parent level. It's above all of this. So we have the data at this top level, and it doesn't matter how many times I leave and come back, because the main component never gets unmounted. It never gets removed from the page. It means the data is there to stay. Now, is one better than the other? Well, it looks like, yeah, going to here, I always have to refetch. I always have to refetch the data. I don't have to do that here. Well, it's a question of, is the data something that's always going to be static, or is there a chance that the data could change? If the data could change, it's better to fetch it when you render the component. When you render the component, the data is never going to change, or it's extremely rare that it changes. Okay, put it one level up inside that main. Now, the data still has to be someplace where it's accessible to both people and person, or films and film. It still has to be in a place where both those components can see it. But I could go up one more level and store it there if that parent component is something that never unmounts, like our main component. The main component is the one that has our basic routing, all this stuff. So I've got people and person. Both of them are being passed this state value, people, and that was this fetch. So inside of main, I've got one fetch that's getting people. Inside of people, there's no more fetch needed. I'm just passing the array down. So right here, I'm saving it the first time I fetch it, and then because main is never removed from my page by any sort of routing, this data is there to stay. As long as my website is open, this is going to be there. And I could replicate this. I could have one set of data for people, one for films, and one for planets. All up at this top main level. Then I've got the 3 arrays that just get passed down as props. If they ever do get updated, then we get new data automatically passed down to those components. But only passed down if they're actually rendered. Okay, so this is dynamic routing. The ability to put parameters inside your URL. So in your route, if your path has something that starts with a colon, this becomes a variable that is now accessible to you. You can go in and get that value. And the easiest way to get it is using the hooks. Now let's use person as an example here. We're calling this route, and inside of person, we're passing down this list, but this URL is also being passed down there. So I'll just save to make sure that's all in there. If I come over here and we go into person, inside of here, I'm going to use the first of the hooks that come with React Router DOM. Now there are 3 of them. Use params, or 4 of them, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them here. Use params, use location, and use history. Now if you've ever worked with the window.location object or window.history, that's what these are. These are giving you those objects with parameters that are available to you. Use params gives you all of those variables, the things that we were talking about here in main, like ID, or if there was something else, like if there was multiple parts, like that, I would have ID and ASDF. I would have these 2 things available as variables. I'm going to get rid of that, save it again. So I have one variable coming through here, and it's going to be called ID, but whatever passes through here, that's going to be available inside of params. So by importing it from React Router DOM, I can call use params, and then let's just write out what's inside of here. So console.log params, and actually we may as well do all 3. So let location equal use location, let history equal use history. So we're going to get all 3 of these objects, and I will give them each a label. So P for params, L for location, H for history. We'll change our variables, hist and look. There we go. We save that. So these 3 things, when we load person, we should see these in the console. Okay, so let's refresh this page, and we're in the person details. So PLH, here we go. P, params. It is the object, and it's got one property called ID, and it is the value 4. When I reload my page, I click on one of these other ones. We change to 6. Now my params is this object with ID 6. L, location. This gives me the path name right here, people/6. So that is my URL. And this path name property inside of here is actually the exact same as if I wrote window.location.pathname. H, that's my history object. And inside of there, I've got all of these things. I've got methods, like push and replace is the same as push state and replace state inside of the actual history object. So anything that you need about history, location, or the parameters being passed through without having to parse them out, without having to take this string and then parse it out yourself, here I'm getting it with a reference, ID. That's what I've called it. So that's all built in there. And key is like a hash value representing this URL right here. So we have all these things available to us. I'm going to just comment that one out. I'll remove these 2 because the only one we're using is params right now. We'll comment out these 2, and I will delete those from my code. I do not need them. So params, I'm getting the ID. And again, we could use destructuring if we wanted here as well. We could just say, I want the ID parameter from the params object. Then I don't have to do this. I have the ID. And we could use const here too. That's going to work fine. So ID, use params, and then I'm using it right here. The list that's being passed in, I don't have to do use effect, wait for the fetch, when the fetch is done, find this thing so I can put it in state. It's being passed through. The actual array is held up inside of main.js. It's being passed down to me as a prop that I'm extracting right here using destructuring, and then I'm looping through it. But it's a synchronous operation. I'm doing all of this before the rendering takes place. And then down here on my page, I don't need params anymore. I just use the variable ID. And here, I'm doing some more conditional rendering. If person exists, so this list is being passed down to me. I'm checking to make sure person exists because it is possible to get an array but have an ID that doesn't exist. So what if this was people 642? Okay, I don't want my page to crash. Here's the ID number that I'm writing just to see it as a reference on my page, but it doesn't exist in this array, and therefore I don't want anything going wrong here. All I'm going to do is say, okay, if person is a truthy value, I want to write out the name. If it's truthy, write out this. So this is a quick and easy way to do conditional rendering inside of your components. All right, so that's it. That's the hooks. Use params, use location, use history, and then we can use that data inside of here. Even if this wasn't directly inside of a route, like if I had some other component, if there was something else that I had brought in called other, inside of other, I could also add the hooks. I can import, use params just like this. I could do that inside of other, and other would be able to get access to that information as well. Okay, great. So there's our dynamic routing. There's the hooks. We've done a little bit of conditional rendering. Link versus NavLink. Let's take a look at that one now. We've got inside of people where we're writing this out. I've got NavLink inside of here. We're used to the parameter class name. We've used that throughout our React components. And if I do this in NavLink, we're fine. I've got my class rendering these things with the orange-red color. If we go into people.css, here's that class name, there's the color that's being rendered. Okay, so that's class name. NavLink, really the only difference between NavLink and link, the biggest difference is the fact that we have the ability to add this. Active class name is the property that I'm creating, and now it understands that the anchor tag that it's generating gets this class name, but only if it matches whatever's up here. So its route, which is the 2, right here, this 2 parameter, if that value matches what is written up here, then the active class gets applied. So if I click on C3PO, the 2 matches the 2 value in here. Darth Vader, the number 4, people/4, matches the 2 attribute inside of here. So that class is being dynamically added by NavLink for us. So all that functionality is built in. If you use NavLink instead of link, this is what you get to do. Up here, we could apply the same thing. So if I opened up nav, here's our links. Well, if I change these all to NavLink, if I just do that, oh, we got to do the import as well. Import NavLink instead of link. Nothing really changed here, but inside of nav.css, I've got a class name here, and I can add the orange-red by just coming in and adding active class name is that. So if I add that in all 3 of them, they understand if they match. There we go. People is now red because I'm on the people list. If I go to films, that's the current one. That's the current one. So we're getting this functionality in here. So in my planets, I think I've got that thing set as just class name inside of my NavLink. Yeah, it's just class name. So if I change that to active class name, now it will highlight that it matches. And you'll note this matches even though there's the number after it. So I'm getting both levels matching through that route. If I only wanted this one, we could add the attribute inside of here, exact, then it's only going to match an exact match here, which means this one would match if there was the 9, and this one would highlight if there wasn't a number after it. I don't want that functionality. I want both, so I'm leaving the exact attribute out of there. Okay, and the last part was the empty results. Oh no, we already had the empty results. Redirect, that was the last part that we needed. So the redirect, what do I do if somebody comes in here and they write gibberish? Okay, these are all rendering, and that's absolutely fine, but the routing inside of main, we didn't have any matches inside of here. So what do we do for that? Let's go back up into app. We're loading main. So this, and this, there's no routing around them. All three of those are rendering with that gibberish that we had up in here. Nothing stopping them from rendering. Inside of main, now I've got routes. So I'm saying if we've got this, or this, or this, or this, I know what to render. If I have an exact match for this, I'm going to return this. But what do I do if I have a route that doesn't match this? That is why we have this redirect. This is another tag that we can add. We have to import it. It comes from the same place as route, which is our React Router DOM right here. So I'm going to add that in here. We're going to say route, and I also want redirect, as well as my use location. My use location here, that the other hook, I'm actually using that inside of main. I think I mentioned that earlier, to get the path name to do the match against people. Now, this is one of my dependencies for my use effect, which means if this changes, I run this function again. We could here at this point say window.location.pathname, and it does the exact same thing. But since I have the variable and I'm using it here as a dependency, why not just do this? There we go. It's working. All right, back to redirect. We have redirect here. Come down to the bottom, and my redirect, what I'm going to do is, if I got to this point and there was no matches, I can come in here and say path, or sorry, not path 2, to do a redirect. Where do I want to send somebody to if they get down to this point? Well, in this case, what I want to do is I want to send them back to the home. Now, that's a logical place to send it. So whatever this path is right here for home, that's what I'm going to put inside of here. Redirect does have some other attributes, like you can put it from, and okay, if you get this thing, send them there. And that works great if I'm rendering a whole bunch of different things. And I want to add this on the end, but this really would only work if I knew exactly what the old URL was to send them to here. I don't. I want to build something that's going to handle any one of these situations, so they could type anything at all. If I got to this point and it didn't match anything, this is where I want to send them. Now, one problem I have here is that this needs to be done inside the switch, which was the thing that I removed because I wanted to have two routes here. That can be handled. So I'm going to add the switch in here. We're going to go back up to the import. I'm going to add my switch inside of there. So the switch is back, and I'm going to change my fragment into a switch again. So now it's going to render one route, this, or this, or this, or this. So it's going to have to choose between these. Did it do this? And it comes to this one before this one, so it's always going to do people and then stop. It's not going to do this part unless I take the route and I move it down here. Now, this is inside of this route. I'm still rendering two separate components at the same level. They're still going to have the same access to that property that I defined inside of main. So no problem there. And I've turned this into a single match. So if it starts with people, I'm good. This is a decision that it will make after that. And this is no longer a one of. Now it will do whatever is inside of this route. The switch applies to the outer, not the inner. So switch, great. Home, okay, wasn't that. Redirect to, okay. If I got to this point, it means I've made it past all of my valid routes, and I'm going to send the person back to here. So let's jump back to the browser. I'm going to refresh this. And here's the home. Films work. Yep. Planets, we're good. People, we're still good. I click on films again. Yep. People. I can go to the details for people. That still works. Details for films. That still works. But if I come up here and I say this route, it sends me back to home. It does do the redirect for me. People, there we go, still works, but I was sent back to home because of that redirect. And that is dynamic routing and everything else that you probably need to know about routing. So we've got those hooks that allow us to get it into the params and the location and the history. We've got routes with and without switch. We've got a redirect that we can use with switch. We have nested routing that we're using for films and planets. We've got routing at the same level, so people and person both being rendered together. When we're doing this, we've got the state up at the higher level at a place that's not being re-rendered. So as soon as main is rendered for the first time, that's when we're going to have access to this data saved up inside of main. And if you delve into films and planets and do the state setting inside of there, it means every time you're leaving it, every time you're unmounting those things, you are losing that state data from those components. But if it's data that changes frequently, that may be exactly what you want to do. You want to have the fresh data. So up to you which approach you take on that. All right, if you have any questions about routing, feel free to leave those in the comments. I answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.